Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Alexandra Magdalena Mironesko, and I'm from the University of Granada, Spain. And today I would like you to go with me into a very special journey, a journey through women's education, which goes from tradition to modernity. First of all, we must acknowledge that education is one of the most important pieces of human civilization. Yes, has not been homogeneous if we compare different countries and cultures. A great example of this is the education in China and its interesting history, especially if we talk about women's education in China. First of all, we have to talk about the basis of traditional education, which was very different for men and women. In the Confucian society, men had more status than women, and the main goal for most of the male population was to pass the imperial exams and become a junzi, an ideal man, who was an educated and cultured man. Yet, the real objective was to achieve advantages that came with status, as well the money. Therefore, they might not have been that ideal men. To achieve this goal, men had to learn and study from very young age the classics, analects, and the Confucian books and so, which were the basis of the exam's contents. To achieve this goal, men had to learn and study from very young age the classics, the analects, and the Confucian books, and so, which were the basis of the exam's contents. On the other hand, women had less status. While their counterparts learned how to read and write and were immersed in the Confucian classics, women were expected to learn how to be a good daughter-in-law, a good wife, and a good mother. Their main field of learning was cooking and sewing, as well as household management, and only wealthy girls could learn a glimpse of their male counterparts. But don't be mistaken. This was for them to be the very first teachers of the male sons, so the mother could teach the child the basis of the future academic curricula. Now, this is a very summarized part of a long Chinese history, and these circumstances I've mentioned before will change in the late 19th and 20th centuries. First of all, China would suffer a few martial defeats, such as the two open wars and the First Sino-Japanese War, which would destabilize the balance of the Qing dynasty. It was clear that China did not have the development as other countries, such as the British Empire, the United States, or Japan, to mention a few, and if China did not start to change and reform itself, it could be the end of the empire. The 19th century is an era of intellectuals and reformists, of critiques against the traditional educational system, and the beginning of tensions and discontent against the Qing Empire. There was a need of new technology, science, languages, and, of course, new education that would develop the country and save it, and Chinese intellectuals and reformists would use Western countries as a reference. This period of reforms and changes before the proclamation of the Republic did affect the women's education, too. There was a combination between the arrival of Christian missionaries and interest in Chinese reformists to change the women's education. This led to the foundation of the very first institutions and schools for Chinese girls. Some of these schools were places to educate the future clergymen's wives, and most of the girls were paupers from rural areas. Slowly, the idea that women should also take part in the new China grew amongst the intellectuals. After all, with the exclusion of rural women, females were consumers instead of producers, and thus an economical load for the family. Also, wealthy families began to view education based on Western skills as something distinguished and fancy, a nice addition for the future wife. Here we can see some of these schools and the numbers. As we can see, between 1912 and 1916, the number of girls was more or less the same in different centers. Also, the belief from intellectuals such as Liang Jizhao that the wife of the future intellectuals should also be a cultured woman gained popularity, as well the concept that they should be active members and contribute to the household finances. This is how the first modern education institutions began. It had to be said that, sadly, the duration of these schools was usually very short. They were frequently limited if we compare it to the growing numbers of schools academies, and so for the male Chinese population. Despite this clear imbalance, the preparation of these schools for girls and the labor of the women who participated in this project is still admirable to these days. This pre-republican period is also important for the reforms that took place and the development of new education, as we can see with the foundation of the Peking University in 1898. One of the few things that survived from the Hundred-Day Reforms, which were a series of proposals to develop the country by Emperor Guangxu, but cut by his aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi. Still, this achievement for education didn't mean an achievement for women's education, since they were still not allowed to study in this kind of institutions. Now let's take a leap into history, because let's remember we were in the middle of some tensions between revolutionaries and traditionalists. It happens that in 1911 the revolution is successful, and Sun Yat-sen, the so-called father of revolution, comes back to China in 1912, the year that would be recognized as the year of the birth of the Republic. Yet this story has a twist, for Sun Yat-sen had to strike a deal with Yuan Shikai, the military general of the Qing dynasty, the presidency in exchange of the abdication of the last emperor, Pu Yi. For everyone's surprise, or maybe not, shortly after being appointed as the president, Yuan Shikai decides that being an emperor suits him better. That's his last mistake, for the new dynasty is very short-lived, and he will die 4 years later, leaving the Republic of China in the hands of a weak government and the warlords. To these days, many historians debate that China wasn't ready for a new system of government, and that the Republican era came way too soon. Anyway, this wouldn't stop the course of education, and events as the mandatory elementary co-education for girls and boys, new schools and new curricula took place in these early years. Here, for example, we can see the growth of the female students in higher education through the years, with a bigger amount through the years and yet still very low if compared to the male counterparts. Again, this education was largely available for girls from wealthy families. Now we must travel to 1914 and 1919. In 1914, World War I broke and China allied with some of the great powers, such as France, but did not participate in a direct way. Still, the Treaty of Versailles was drafted after the war and demanded concessions from China. We have to remind here that countries such as France, Germany, the United States, or Japan were a huge influence for China and its development and modernization. Thus, when the Allies tried to force China to sign the treaty, in which China was more like a defeated enemy than an ally, giving Japan control over some Chinese territory, students across China marched on 4th May of 1919 as a form of protest. These protests achieved the goal and China did not sign the treaty, but also exhorted to keep fighting for cultural and educative innovation in China. It was a period where the topic of the language was discussed, and more importantly, after the May 4th movement, a group of girls petitioned Cai Yuanpei, then president of the Peking University, to enroll into the center. Cai Yuanpei was one of the most important intellectuals of his period, as he was a reformist and humanist, and he served as Minister of Education in 1912 and as a headmaster of multiple schools, as well as patriotic girls' schools in Shanghai. But let's go back to our main characters in this episode, who are the girls who asked for access to the Peking University. The name of these pioneers are preserved thanks to the archival efforts of the Peking University, and we even know that it was Deng Zhonlan, the one who wrote Cai Yuanpei after the May 4th movement. We have to make a note here and clarify that, even if Cai Yuanpei was what we would call a feminist in that moment, he had, like many others, a moderate approach to the topic, for it wasn't until these girls asked to enroll but he even considered the access of women to this institution. Yet, he took a risk and immediately accepted the girls into the university before conservatives had a chance to protest. He took advantage of the fact that there was no rule against women in the university, so no one had even considered this legal loophole, or that women would take advantage of it. Here we have a translation quoting Cai Yuanpei's words about this matter. I have always advocated equality between men and women. In 9 years, some female students asked to enroll in the school, and when some recruitment was done, the girls were officially enrolled. This was the beginning of mixed schools. Later, all universities accepted women's students on part-time basis. This way, in 1920, the very first female students, a total of 9 girls, entered the Peking University as guests, meaning that they had not taken any entrance examination. To these days, we know the names of these pioneers and even where did they study before entering the Peking University. With these first female students, co-education in the higher levels became a reality. This was indeed a great beginning for education in China, but growth would be slow. Still, this was a milestone in the modernization of China. Here we can see, between the 1923 and the 1927, the growth of a number of men and women in universities and institutes of higher education. Of course, we can see it now as a very small number, but the growth of the amount of women with access to higher education was a great achievement. After this journey through time, I would like to jump into some conclusions. We can see that the journey of female education in China was a long one, mainly brought by social and political circumstances, but also brought by the brave women who fought for their rights. We can also agree that the history of Chinese education is a very vast field, yet the subject remained fairly unknown outside the academia. Thus, for example, my youngest students of the first year, who have little or no knowledge about China at all, have difficulties to tell the difference between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. We all can imagine then how difficult it can be to reach every simple aspect of such rich and interesting culture and civilization which is the Chinese one. Now, the significant influence of other countries in China in the 19th and 20th centuries is also in need of a future research, in order to better understand the connections between the world and China, the influences, the references, and so on. Finally, I hope I could conduct future research in a variety of Chinese universities. During the COVID pandemic, there were no chances of traveling to China, but I hope that I can reconnect and resume my academic exchange in order to further our understanding in this fascinating topic, emphasizing the women's education. Now, here we have some of the bibliography used for this paper and presentation, which you can also check in the uploaded PDF in the page of the workshop. And the last but not least, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and again having me here and giving me space for this presentation. I hope you like it and it was of your interest. Thank you very much.